Dirt crumbled from the trench walls as the night pressed in, heavy and suffocating. Lanterns flickered, throwing nervous shadows across exhausted faces. The men tried to convince themselves the silence was safety, but their breaths came short and their hands trembled on steel. Then came a sound no soldier could explain, a grinding rasp that seemed to scrape against their very bones. Figures shifted in the haze, bending out of shape, until a presence rose from the black soil itself. It was not an enemy of flesh and blood, but something far older and far crueler, waiting to claim them all. The sun slipped beneath the horizon like a dying ember, leaving the battlefield drenched in a heavy gloom. Smoke from the day's shelling hung low, clinging to the earth in thick, choking strands. The trenches, once roaring with gunfire, now sank into silence, broken only by the shuffle of weary boots. Men huddled into their coats, shivering not from the cold but from something unspoken, gnawing in the back of their minds. Night was coming, and with it came the kind of dread no soldier could put into words. Lanterns sputtered against the rising wind, their flicker casting jagged shadows that stretched unnaturally across the trench walls. Every soldier had seen death before, but tonight the silence was sharper, pressing in from every direction. They tried to steady themselves with jokes, with cigarettes, with talk of home. Yet each word died quickly, smothered by the uneasy weight of the dark. Even the ground seemed restless, trembling faintly as if it too feared what the night might bring. Far beyond the wire, the ruins of a shattered village stood like blackened teeth against the fading sky. The place had been abandoned for months, but some swore they still saw movement there. A shutter closing, a figure at the window, always just beyond sight, always vanishing when they looked again. Command dismissed it as nerves, as tricks of smoke and shadow, but the men knew better. Some things didn't belong in war, and yet they lingered on the edges, waiting. The air thickened as the stars emerged, pale and distant, doing little to pierce the choking haze. An owl screeched somewhere in the woods, but it sounded warped, stretched, almost human in its pain. The soldiers shifted uneasily, hands tightening around their rifles. Their nerves were drawn thin from weeks without rest, but this fear felt older, deeper. It wasn't the enemy they dreaded now. It was something that prowled between the moments, in the silence where breath seemed too loud. One soldier lit a cigarette, and the flare illuminated a row of hollow eyes staring back at him. He laughed nervously, offering the glow to a friend beside him, but the ember died too quickly, swallowed by the dark. They had enough ammunition to fight a regiment, yet every man in that trench felt utterly defenseless. No training could prepare them for the heaviness that pressed down, a sense that unseen eyes were already watching from the black soil. The trench itself groaned under the weight of earth, timbers creaking like old bones. Mud dripped steadily into the dugouts, thick and sluggish, as though the ground itself was bleeding. The smell of damp rot clung to everything: boots, uniforms, even skin. Every cough echoed too loudly. Every movement snapped the silence. Men stared at the shadows around them, half expecting them to peel away from the walls and take shape. They spoke little, as though words might invite something listening in the dark. Beyond the wire, a fog rolled in from the marshes, curling low and heavy, swallowing the last remnants of the horizon. It carried with it a bitter stench, something sour, metallic, almost like blood. The men shifted, muttering to one another in clipped tones, trying to convince themselves it was nothing but weather. But deep down, they knew fog didn't smell like that. And when the breeze shifted, the smell clung stronger, as if the mist itself carried a sickness. A sentry posted at the far end of the trench squinted into the fog. He swore he saw a figure moving just beyond the wire, tall and hunched, swaying unnaturally with each step. He rubbed his eyes, blaming fatigue, but when he looked again, it was still there. No helmet, no uniform, no features he could make out, just a bulk that drifted in silence. He lowered his rifle, uncertain if bullets would do anything against something that moved like smoke. Whispers traveled down the trench line faster than the cold. Men began to murmur about old tales, about creatures their grandfathers warned them of. Superstition ran deep in their bones, and war had only fed it. Some spoke of demons haunting blood-soaked ground, others of spirits bound to battlefields. Whatever it was, they all agreed this was not the enemy they had trained to fight. Fear spread faster than fire, curling around every heart until even the bravest faltered. The night grew heavier, pressing down like a weight on their chests. Even the insects had gone silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The fog thickened, swallowing the outer posts one by one until the trench felt like an island adrift in black water. The men clung to their rifles, but their eyes betrayed them, wide, darting, glistening with terror they could not name. And above them, the sky seemed to sag lower, suffocating in its silence. A sudden sound cracked the air, a scrape, sharp and deliberate, like claws dragging against wood. Every man froze, breath caught in their throats. The noise came again, closer this time, reverberating through the mud walls. The sentries shouted a warning, but their voices sounded small, swallowed almost instantly by the fog. Then came the shuffling, heavy, uneven, as if something massive dragged itself closer with each agonizing step. The air stank of iron and decay. One soldier, braver than the rest, climbed halfway up the trench wall, peering over the sandbags. His scream tore through the stillness before his body fell back, eyes wide, face ashen. He said nothing, only shook his head violently, lips trembling too hard to form words. The men around him pressed closer, panic swelling like a tide. Whatever he had seen, it was worse than anything their minds could conjure. And still, the scraping grew louder, steadier. The commander barked for calm, ordering the men to hold their line, to remember their training. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He too had heard the sound, felt the vibration in his boots. He clutched his pistol like a lifeline, eyes darting to the edges of the trench where the shadows seemed to writhe. For the first time, rank meant nothing. He was just another man staring into the abyss, praying that whatever was out there would pass them by. The first shot rang out, not from command but from a terrified private who fired blindly into the fog. The blast lit the trench for a fraction of a second, but in that flash, the men swore they saw something vast and formless looming at the wire. The bullet made no impact. No cry, no fall, only silence. And then the fog shifted, parting just enough to show a shape crouched low, eyes gleaming like burning coals in the black. The silence shattered as the men scrambled to their posts, hearts pounding so loudly they drowned out thought. The fog seemed to pulse, surging forward with the stench of rot and blood. Shadows convulsed against the trench walls, twisting in grotesque forms, and as the first scream erupted from the darkness beyond the wire, they knew the night had only just begun, and whatever stalked them was not something any soldier would live to describe. The mud clung to every step like it wanted to pull the soldiers under. Boots sank deep, sucking at their soles, leaving behind slurping echoes that carried unnaturally in the still night. The ground felt heavier than it should, damp with more than just rainwater. It gave beneath their weight, soft and shifting, as though something beneath the surface moved with them. Each man tried to shake the feeling that the earth itself resented their presence. Stale water pooled in low spots, rippling even when no one moved nearby. Some swore they felt vibrations running through the muck, faint at first, then sharp, like something scratching far below. The trench was supposed to be solid, a refuge carved into the earth. Instead, it felt alive, restless, as if it had a will of its own. Soldiers muttered quietly, too afraid to admit aloud that the mud was whispering back with every step they took. The smell rising from the soaked soil was unbearable. It wasn't just rot. It was acrid, metallic, and sour, carrying the sting of something decomposing in secret. Even with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, the stench found its way into lungs and stomachs, making bile rise in throats. They told themselves it was corpses buried shallow by bombardment, but deep down, the scent felt older, fouler. It was the smell of something that had never been human. A private knelt to tie his boot and froze when the ground pulsed beneath his hand. His fingers brushed something slick and leathery beneath the surface. He recoiled, scrambling backward, his face pale as if drained of all color. Others laughed nervously, telling him it was nothing but a root, but no one checked for themselves. In war, men learned to believe their senses, and his trembling eyes told them he had touched something alive. Waterlogged walls sagged inward, dripping with rivulets of slime that glistened like black oil under lantern light. Each drip struck with a hollow plop, steady and rhythmic, as though counting down. Soldiers tried to ignore it, but the beat grew louder in their heads until every drop sounded like a drum. They clenched their jaws, refusing to look up, terrified that if they did, the mud above would open to reveal something waiting. A low rumble rolled through the ground, subtle at first, then undeniable. Canteens rattled. Rifles quivered against the trench walls, and the men's teeth chattered involuntarily. No artillery fell, no shells landed. It wasn't an explosion. It was deeper, slower, like a beast stirring beneath the battlefield. Some swore they saw bubbles rise in the puddles, bursting with a faint hiss. Whatever lived in the mud was closer now, awake and restless. Rats, normally bold scavengers, fled in droves. Their tiny bodies scrambled over boots and packs, desperate to escape the trench they had once ruled. Soldiers watched them vanish into the dark, their squeals fading until nothing remained but silence. Men who had long cursed the rats for gnawing at rations now felt their stomachs twist at their absence. If vermin abandoned the trenches, it meant something worse had claimed them. The men began to feel watched, not from the fog, but from below. Eyes glanced downward without reason, unable to stop searching the sludge underfoot. Some swore they saw shapes shifting beneath the waterlogged soil, coils sliding, limbs stretching, forms pressing up against the surface before sinking again. It was always just out of focus, always dissolving back into muck when looked at directly. The soldiers' fear wasn't of the unseen, it was of the seen but ungraspable. One man slipped on the slick ground, plunging shoulder deep into a pit of mud. His scream ripped through the trench as he thrashed, swearing something coiled around his leg. Others pulled him free, his face streaked with terror and sludge. When they cut the laces of his boot, they found gouges deep in the leather, grooves that looked more like claws than rocks. He said nothing afterward, but his silence spoke louder than words ever could. The commander tried to calm the men, insisting the ground was unstable, nothing more, but even he shifted uneasily, flinching when mud dripped against his sleeve. His hand trembled as he wiped it away, only to smear a dark residue that smelled faintly of copper. He ordered the lanterns raised higher, though every man knew it was useless. Light did nothing to stop what hid beneath the earth. It only made the shadows in the muck deeper. The sound of breathing emerged, not their own, not human. It rose from the soil itself, wet and uneven, like air forcing its way through lungs. Drowned in filth, the men froze, listening as the trench seemed to inhale and exhale around them. Some covered their ears. Others prayed under their breath, but the sound persisted, rattling in their bones. Whatever lived below was alive, awake, and aware of them. Sleep was impossible. Men sat with backs pressed to the walls, rifles clenched, eyes fixed on the mud as if daring it to move. Each second stretched into an eternity, every heartbeat louder than gunfire. They whispered that the ground itself was hungry, that it was pulling at their boots, waiting for one to stumble. None dared close their eyes, for they feared that when they opened them, the trench would be empty and silent forever. Then came the gurgling, a deep, wet churn rising like water boiling in a pot. It spread across the trench floor, bubbles swelling and bursting with foul gas that burned the throat. Men gagged, coughing violently, unable to escape the suffocating air. The mud itself was alive, convulsing, restless, heaving, as though preparing to spit something out. And for the first time, the men realized the trench was not their shelter, it was their grave. Hands began to tremble uncontrollably. Some gripped their rifles until knuckles split, others clenched rosaries until beads cracked. They waited for the inevitable, for the thing beneath them to break free. The fog above seemed merciful in comparison. At least fog could be escaped. But the mud, it clung, it swallowed, it dragged. There was no outrunning the ground they stood on. The only question was when it would claim its first victim. A single cry shattered the silence. A man at the far end of the line screamed as the mud beneath him collapsed. His body sank waist deep before anyone could move, dragged by something unseen. They rushed to pull him free, but his shrieks grew sharper, his hands clawing desperately at the air. Then, as suddenly as it began, he was gone. The mud closed over him with a sickening gulp, leaving only ripples in the black water. And in that moment, the soldiers knew the earth itself had turned against them. It began faintly, almost like a vibration running along the trench floorboards. The men paused, thinking it was distant artillery echoing underground. But there was no impact, no thunder of shells, no crumbling earth. This was different, steady, deliberate, unnatural. The sound crawled through the mud and bones alike, a low resonance that set teeth on edge. No man had ever heard such a noise before, and none wanted to admit it out loud. The soldiers tilted their heads, listening harder than they ever had in battle. It wasn't wind, nor the groan of timbers, nor the rumble of tanks in the distance. It was a layered tone, like several voices humming at once, buried beneath the earth. Their chests tightened as the pitch rose and fell, never breaking, never pausing for breath. Something was alive beneath them, and it was singing a note that belonged to no world they knew. Fear made the sound sharper. Once they noticed it, they could not unhear it. Some clutched their ears, swearing it was drilling through their skulls. Others claimed it matched the rhythm of their own heartbeats, sinking until they couldn't tell where their body ended and the noise began. The trench was no longer silent. It throbbed with a voice older than language. Even the bravest among them shifted uneasily, desperate to drown it out, yet unable to move away. Lanterns shook as the sound deepened, rattling the glass until flames sputtered. One man swore he heard words in the vibration, whispers curling beneath the hum, too faint to understand. He muttered them back, lips trembling, as though the sound itself was forcing him to repeat. The others silenced him with shouts, but the damage was done. His eyes had gone glassy, his voice hollow, as though he had lent part of himself to whatever was speaking through the earth. The noise grew bolder, dragging across frequencies like claws against stone. It rose high enough to make eardrums ache, then plunged low enough to shake water from puddles. The trench walls trembled with each wave, sending showers of dirt down onto helmets. Rifles clattered where they leaned, vibrating against the wood as though alive. Men gritted their teeth, jaws aching, waiting for the sound to relent, but it only swelled, greedy and insistent. At times it resembled a scream, not sharp, not human, but drawn out and buried beneath layers of soil, stretched so far it became inhuman. Other moments it resembled a heartbeat, pounding slow and steady, but far too powerful to belong to anything mortal. The soldiers exchanged frantic glances, each man silently asking the same question: what kind of creature makes a sound like this? No answer came, only the noise swelling into a language none could comprehend. One by one, men began to cover their ears, but it was useless. The sound didn't travel through air. It lived inside the body. It slithered into marrow, resonated in teeth, coiled around nerves. Some convulsed, dropping to their knees, as though shocked by unseen wires. Others screamed for silence, their cries swallowed instantly by the endless hum. The trench had become an instrument, and every man inside it was nothing more than a string waiting to be plucked. A medic pressed his stethoscope against the mud, desperate to locate the source. He yanked it away a moment later, screaming that it wasn't sound at all, it was breathing. The men stared at him in disbelief, but then realized he was right. Each wave rose and fell like lungs filling and emptying, but slower, deeper, as though the world itself exhaled through unseen lungs. Whatever lived below was alive, enormous, and it was listening back. The vibrations shifted suddenly, warping into something sharper, something closer to speech. Words formed from the rhythm, guttural and alien, slipping into their ears with sickening clarity. Men shouted prayers, some in Latin, some in broken whispers to mothers long dead. Yet even their prayers began to match the cadence, their words twisting into syllables they did not recognize. The sound wasn't only heard, it was teaching them, rewriting their tongues against their will. One soldier snapped. He tore his helmet off, smashing it against the trench wall, screaming that the sound was crawling inside his skull. His eyes bled at the corners, thin red streams tracing down his cheeks. He begged someone to shoot him, to end it before the noise hollowed him out completely. None dared lift a weapon, for they feared that pulling a trigger would only make the sound angry. His screams blended into the hum, until no one could tell them apart. The trench seemed to pulse in rhythm with the noise. Boards flexed as though breathing. Mud heaved like muscle beneath their boots. The entire structure no longer felt man-made. It felt like they were inside the rib cage of something vast, something alive. The men clung to their rifles, but rifles were useless against something that existed in vibration, in resonance, in the spaces between silence. Their weapons suddenly felt like toys in the hands of frightened children. A strange phenomenon followed. Lantern flames leaned toward the sound as though pulled by unseen wind. Compass needles spun wildly, unable to settle on direction. Watches stopped ticking, their gears rattling against themselves until they broke apart. Every tool of man's design failed in unison, as though nature itself bent in obedience to the hum. The soldiers realized with growing horror that this sound was not bound by the rules of their world. The longer it persisted, the more it seemed to call something closer. Footsteps echoed in the mud, where no one walked. Shadows quivered against the trench walls, stretching and retracting in time with the vibration. Some men swore they saw shapes rise from puddles, faces forming for only a heartbeat before dissolving back into water. The sound had become a summoning, a chorus calling forth things that were never meant to be seen. Sleep-deprived and desperate, the men tried firing into the mud, into the fog, into the night itself. Each bullet cracked the air, but none silenced the vibration. The gunfire sounded pitiful in comparison, like children banging pots in a storm. Their shots echoed, then vanished, swallowed whole by the endless hum. And in the silence after the gunfire, the sound returned louder, angrier, as though mocking their attempt to fight back. The commander ordered silence, but his voice was weak, drowned beneath the roar. His lips moved, but his words twisted into foreign tones before leaving his mouth. The men stared in horror as their leader became a mouthpiece for the sound itself, his commands warping into chants no human could understand. He tried to stop, clamping his jaw shut, but his teeth rattled. His throat convulsed and the words spilled out anyway. A chill wind cut through the trench, carrying the sound higher, thinner, until it scraped against the stars themselves. The sky trembled as if responding, clouds swirling unnaturally overhead. Lightning flickered in silence, branching without thunder, illuminating faces pale with terror. The men realized the sound was no longer confined to the earth. It was reaching upward, clawing at the heavens. Something below was calling to something above. The earth cracked in small fissures, releasing steam that hissed with the same pitch as the hum. It smelled of sulfur, of charred stone and burnt flesh. The men gagged, covering their noses, but the scent burned inside their skulls, impossible to escape. Each hiss carried a sharp note, adding to the chorus, until the trench itself became an orchestra of death. The men were trapped in the front row, unwilling spectators to a concert that would never end. Some collapsed to their knees, defeated, rocking back and forth in rhythm with the sound. Their eyes rolled back, whites showing, lips mumbling in languages they had never spoken before. Others held their weapons tightly, but the fight had drained from them. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were prey caught in the song of a predator too vast to comprehend. Every instinct screamed to run, yet their legs refused to move. The noise reached a climax, swelling until it felt as if the world itself would split apart. Helmets cracked, glass shattered, and teeth rattled loose from gums. Blood dripped from ears, noses, even eyes, staining uniforms in dark streaks. Yet through the pain, through the horror, none could stop listening. The sound had become a truth, a revelation, dragging them to the edge of sanity where only madness remained. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Absolute, suffocating, unnatural. The men gasped, clutching their ears, but heard nothing. Not the wind, not the rustle of rats, not even the pounding of their own hearts. It was as though the world had been muted, and in that void, in that endless quiet, every soldier realized the truth. The sound hadn't vanished. It had gone inside them, and it was waiting. The fog hung thick, swallowing even the lantern light until the trench became a tunnel of suffocating dark. Every man felt the weight of unseen gazes pressing against his back. They turned sharply at shadows, yet found nothing. Only the shifting black that seemed to lean closer each time. Fear gnawed at them, not of bullets or shells, but of something lurking just beyond their sight, patient and deliberate. Then came the glimmer, small, faint, like dew catching a spark of firelight. One soldier thought it a trick, a reflection from his lantern. But when the light moved, the glimmer stayed. Then another appeared and another until the trench line was dotted with cold, unblinking pinpricks in the dark. They were too high, too wide apart, too unnatural to belong to anything human. The men froze, unable to convince themselves these were stars. The longer they stared, the clearer the shapes became. Dozens of pairs hovered in the gloom, motionless yet fixed on the men. The eyes did not blink, did not waver, as if carved into the void itself. Their glow was faintly wet as though alive, glistening with a hunger that pierced through the fog. Soldiers tried to lift rifles, but their arms trembled, their hands slick with sweat. No man wanted to fire first, fearing what the darkness might release. A single pair of eyes drew closer, cutting through the haze like embers dragged across coal. The steps were silent. No crunch of soil, no splash of water. Only the steady approach of something that wanted to be heard only by its gaze. The soldier nearest collapsed to his knees, sobbing, swearing he felt the stare pierce through his chest. The eyes loomed higher, stretching impossibly tall, until they seemed to blot out what little sky remained. The trench filled with the sickening sound of breath. Wet, uneven, almost liquid, the eyes flared, narrowing, locking onto one trembling figure who dared not look away. He whispered a prayer, but the words fell dead against the mud, swallowed before they left his lips. The silence that followed was unbearable, heavy as lead, and then, without warning, the eyes vanished. The soldier collapsed, screaming that they had entered his head, that he could feel them moving inside. Others tried to retreat, stumbling deeper into the trench, but more eyes appeared where none had been before. Some shone pale as milk, others burned crimson like dying coals, but all carried the same hunger. They ringed the trench line, enclosing the soldiers like prey caught in a snare. Lanterns flickered violently, casting weak halos that only revealed more pairs staring back from the edges. The men no longer knew where safety lay. Every direction was death. One soldier cracked under the pressure. He fired blindly into the dark, the muzzle flash revealing twisted outlines that vanished too quickly to recognize. The shot tore the night apart, but when the smoke cleared, the eyes had not moved. They remained unblinking, fixed, patient, almost amused. The shooter backed against the wall, chest heaving, whispering that the darkness itself had laughed. No one corrected him. The commander barked orders, his voice sharp, but it trembled at the edges. He told the men to stand firm, that the eyes were nothing but tricks of fear. Yet even he avoided their glow, turning his head when they lingered too long. His words held no weight, not when every soldier could feel their skin crawl under the weight of countless stares. Authority meant nothing when confronted with eyes that saw too much. One man dared to shine his lantern directly into the fog. For a moment, the eyes disappeared. Relief spread, brittle but real. But when the light shifted, the glow returned, closer, multiplied, sharper than before. They had not retreated. They had only hidden, waiting for arrogance to expose the men's desperation. The soldier dropped his lantern in horror, the flame hissing out in the mud. The trench plunged deeper into blackness than before. The air thickened until it felt like syrup dragging through lungs. Breathing became a labor, each gasp scraping the throat raw. The eyes pulsed faintly, dimming and brightening in rhythm, as though the creatures blinked in unison. The soldiers clung to one another, refusing to break eye contact with the void. They knew instinctively that to look away was to invite the unseen forward, and yet their bodies begged for escape from the crushing tension. Suddenly, one pair of eyes shot upward, rising high into the mist until it vanished beyond sight. The men stood stunned, straining their necks, waiting for it to reappear. Then a scream cut through the trench from the far end. By the time they turned, the scream was already gone, leaving behind only a pool of blood spreading across the mud. No one had seen what took him, only that the eyes had marked him first. The fog thickened, cloaking the trench until distance lost all meaning. Men could no longer see those beside them. only the glowing orbs hanging in the dark. They began to whisper, asking each other if they were real, if they had always been there. But the whispers died when they realized some of the voices did not belong to their unit. Strangers spoke in the blackness, voices hollow, carrying no warmth, as if the eyes themselves were learning to speak. The ground shuddered, a soft quake that rattled helmets and knocked dirt loose. More eyes surfaced from beneath the mud itself, pushing upward as if emerging from shallow graves. Soldiers stumbled backward, tripping over boards slick with slime. Every instinct screamed to climb out, to flee, but the walls themselves seemed to close in, mud caving just enough to trap them in place. The eyes in the earth blinked slowly, deliberate, almost mocking. One soldier began to laugh hysterically, a broken sound that carried through the trench. He pointed into the dark, insisting he recognized faces in the eyes, friends long dead, comrades buried months ago. The others begged him to stop, but his laughter only grew until it cracked into sobs. He pressed his forehead against the mud wall, whispering to someone unseen. When they pulled him back, his eyes were glazed, glowing faintly like the ones in the dark. The commander finally gave the order to retreat, but the path behind was no safer. The eyes had spread there too, lining the trench like torches of unholy light. Their glow revealed silhouettes just beyond reach, tall and twisted, their movements jerky and unnatural. The men realized they were not merely being watched, they were surrounded. Every exit was sealed by stairs that promised death, or worse. Panic set in, and panic was deadly. A lantern toppled, spilling flame across the mud. For an instant, the trench blazed with light, and in that flash the soldiers saw them, shapes too monstrous to describe. Limbs bending wrong, mouths gaping wide with rows of wet teeth. Then the light died, and the eyes returned, brighter than before. No one spoke, for they all knew what they had seen. Some realities could not be denied once glimpsed, and the eyes had revealed more than enough. Time stretched into a torment. Minutes felt like hours as the eyes remained fixed, never blinking, never retreating. The men grew weaker under the pressure, their courage draining like water through a sieve. Each breath came shallower, each heartbeat louder in their ears. They were prisoners of sight, bound by gazes that pinned them in place more effectively than chains. And with each moment, the blackness pressed closer. The silence shattered when one soldier vanished, mid-step. He had been standing shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. Then gone, yanked into the dark so swiftly, not even a cry escaped him. His helmet clattered to the ground, spinning in the mud until it settled with a hollow thud. The men turned wildly, rifles raised, but there was nothing to fire at, only more eyes staring back, unblinking, patient, and hungry. The fog swirled, rising higher, and the eyes lifted with it, circling above like carrion birds. The men tilted their heads, dizzy with terror, as the sky itself seemed alive with glowing orbs. It was no longer a question of what hunted them, but how many. The trench felt like a pit dug not by man but by fate itself, meant to trap them where countless eyes could feast. Hope shriveled, leaving only raw survival instinct. When the first voice finally came, it was not human. It echoed from the blackness, soft but commanding, vibrating through the bones rather than ears. No one understood the words, but every man felt the intent. They were being claimed. The eyes were not merely watching, they were choosing, and as the glow intensified, brighter than lanterns, the soldiers realized there was no escape. For in the blackness, the eyes had already decided their fate. The tension in the trench was unbearable. Men clung to their rifles like lifelines, eyes darting toward every shifting shadow. Fear was no longer whispered. It was written across pale faces and trembling hands. No one dared to blink too long, afraid that if they looked away, they'd return to find one of their own missing. The silence between heartbeats grew heavier, pressing down like the weight of soil above a coffin. It began at the far end of the trench. A muffled gasp broke the air, sharp but brief, and heads turned instantly toward the sound. One soldier was gone, just gone. His post, where moments earlier a shape had stood, now lay empty. His rifle leaned against the wall, mud dripping from its stock as if abandoned mid-duty. A ripple of panic spread, every man staring into the void where their comrade had been. The men scrambled forward, calling his name in hushed, desperate tones. No answer came, only the low whisper of fog curling around the trench. Footprints marked where he had stood, clear in the mud, but they ended abruptly, as if swallowed by the earth. No drag marks, no struggle, no blood. He had simply ceased to exist. That silence screamed louder than any gunfire. Whispers broke out in the ranks. Some muttered he had deserted, climbing into the black to escape the madness. Others swore the eyes had chosen him, plucking him away as easily as a hand snatching a moth from the air. None believed the explanations they gave themselves. The air felt thinner now, their lungs laboring with each breath. Then another sound cut through the quiet. A faint splash in a puddle too soft to come from boots. Lanterns swung frantically toward it, but the glow illuminated nothing but rippling water. A soldier knelt, touching the surface with shaking fingers. The water was warm, unnaturally so, like blood held too long in the sun. His hand recoiled instantly, and his eyes widened in horror. Something else had stepped there. A second man vanished before their eyes. He had stood just 2 paces away, muttering prayers under his breath, when suddenly his body jerked backward into the dark. His scream never escaped his throat. Only a sharp inhale cut short, as though swallowed mid-breath. The men lunged for him, grabbing at the space he had filled, but their hands met only air. The trench felt emptier, colder, more dangerous by the second. Fear shattered discipline. Men began to cluster together, huddled shoulder to shoulder, as if sheer proximity might ward off the invisible hand. Their rifles were raised but useless, trembling in unsteady grips. Orders shouted from the commanders sounded hollow, carried away by the fog before reaching the ears of those further down the line. In their hearts they all knew the trench itself was hunting them. A lantern fell, its glass breaking with a shrill crack. The flame guttered in the mud, spreading a dim, shivering glow across the ground. For the first time, they saw signs, grooves clawed into the soil, slick and fresh, leading away from where their comrades had stood. The lines dragged deeper into the earth until they vanished in darkness. No man wanted to imagine what strength had carved those marks so cleanly. One soldier, pale and trembling, swore he heard voices calling his name. They drifted through the fog, familiar tones of men already lost, begging him to follow. He clamped his hands over his ears, screaming for them to stop, but the voices grew louder. Others began to hear as well, echoes of family, of lovers, of friends, long dead. The trench wasn't just claiming bodies, it was stealing sanity. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night. A true scream this time, raw and human. The men rushed toward it, boots splashing in muck, but the sound cut off abruptly. What remained was a helmet lying upside down in the mud, filled with a thin pool of blood. No body, no trace of where it had been dragged. Only that hollow vessel left behind, mocking them with its emptiness. The commander shouted to hold the line, his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. He insisted no one move alone, no one stray even a step. But as he spoke, his eyes betrayed the truth. He didn't believe his own words. His hands shook as he gripped his pistol, and his gaze darted wildly, refusing to linger on the shadows. Leadership had lost its anchor in the storm of terror. A strange phenomenon followed. The fog seemed to shrink inward, closing tight around the trench like a tightening fist. What little distance remained between men became blurred, distorted. Some swore the soldiers beside them stretched tall, then shortened, then flickered like lantern flames. Others claimed faces shifted into hollow masks for a breath before snapping back. Nothing could be trusted, not even the man standing shoulder to shoulder in the dark. Another disappearance struck, crueler than before. This time it was a soldier holding hands with his comrade, fingers locked tight in desperate solidarity. Yet when the comrade looked down, his grip clutched only air. The man was gone, ripped away so fast that flesh never had time to resist. The surviving soldier screamed, staring at his empty palm as though it had betrayed him. The trench echoed with his anguish. Panic rose like floodwater. Some men tried climbing out of the trench, scrambling up the slick walls despite the danger of exposure, but the fog above shifted, thickening into a wall of impenetrable black. They could climb all night and never reach the top, forever caught in an endless loop of mud and fear. Despair crushed them, heavier than any enemy bombardment. Rifles cracked again, fired blindly into the dark, but the sound was pitiful against the storm of silence. Bullets vanished without echo, swallowed whole by the fog. The men realized with sickening clarity that they weren't fighting an enemy, they were feeding it. Every shot, every scream, every frantic movement seemed to excite the thing lurking just beyond their vision. Then came the worst moment of all. A soldier disappeared not into shadow, not into fog, but before their eyes. His body thinned, stretching into smoke, dissolving into the night as though he had never been flesh at all. His uniform, his gear, his rifle, all disintegrated with him, leaving nothing behind. The men stumbled back in horror, unable to comprehend what they had witnessed. This was no longer death, it was erasure. The trench was broken, morale shattered, discipline gone. Men muttered to themselves, some begging forgiveness, others bargaining with unseen powers. A few simply sat down in the mud, refusing to move, hollow eyes staring into the dark. They had stopped believing in escape. Instead, they waited for their turn to vanish, resigned to the inevitability of disappearance. The commander raised his pistol skyward, firing a flare in desperation. The light hissed into the night, bursting in a weak glow that barely pierced the fog. For an instant, the trench was illuminated, and they saw what had been waiting all along, shapes crowding the edges, tall and twisted, eyes gleaming like stars. Then the light died, and the shapes vanished, leaving only the stairs once more. When the silence returned, it was thinner, stretched like a thread about to snap. The men clung to each other, praying not for survival but for witness, that someone might remain to tell the world of this nightmare. But deep down, they knew the truth. One by one they would vanish, until no trace remained. The first had disappeared and the trench was hungry for more. The trench fell into a silence heavier than stone. No rifles cracked, no boots shuffled, only the slow drip of water echoing against the mud. But beneath that quiet, a new sound emerged, faint as breath carried through the soil. At first the men thought it was the wind threading through cracks. Then they realized the rhythm was too precise, too deliberate. It was speech, muffled, buried deep underfoot. The whispers rose like steam, seeping through the ground in uneven pulses. Some carried upward through the walls, curling into ears like secrets spoken at a bedside. Others bubbled up from puddles, rippling the surface as though words themselves stirred the water. The men froze, straining to catch meaning. But every syllable slipped between comprehension and madness. The voices were not human, and yet they spoke with unmistakable intent. One soldier dropped to his knees, pressing his ear to the mud. His face contorted instantly, eyes bulging as he clawed at his own temples. He screamed that the ground was telling him to follow, that it had promised escape. The others pulled him back, but his body shook violently, convulsing as though the words were crawling inside him. When he finally went limp, his lips still moved, repeating whispers too soft for the rest to hear. The air thickened with unease. Every man swore the whispers called his name, tugging at memory, shaping familiar tones. Some heard their mothers, some their children, some their dead brothers. The trench became a chorus of lies, each soldier haunted by a voice he most longed to hear. But when they tried to respond, their own words came back twisted, warped into alien sounds. The voices below were mocking them. Mud shifted beneath boots, bulging upward as if something pressed against it from below. The whispers grew louder where the earth swelled, vibrating through the men's bones. They stepped back instinctively, afraid to touch the mounds, yet unable to look away. The ground wasn't still anymore. It was breathing, swelling, with each word. The soldiers realized that the whispers were not separate from the soil. The soil itself was speaking. One lantern sputtered, casting wild shadows across the trench. In its dim light, they saw the ground quiver, thin cracks spreading like veins. From those cracks hissed faint threads of air, each one carrying syllables too sharp to belong to man. The whispers overlapped, hundreds of voices speaking at once, weaving into a chant that clawed at sanity. No two men heard the same words, but each swore they understood one thing: they were being summoned. The commander tried to rally them, insisting the voices were tricks of exhaustion, but his words faltered mid-sentence. The whispers rose, mimicking his tone perfectly, repeating his commands in grotesque harmony. His voice echoed back at him from below, distorted, multiplied, and laced with malice. The men stared in horror as their leader fell silent, defeated by the sound of his own orders turned against him. A soldier collapsed suddenly, clawing at the mud as though digging for something. He shouted that the voices were trapped, begging for release. His nails tore bloody lines in the soil, and each handful he pulled free seemed to reveal darker, wetter earth beneath. The men dragged him away, but not before they saw movement in the hole, something pale, thin, and twitching like fingers reaching toward the air. The whispers swelled into laughter, cruel and echoing, rolling through the trench like thunder. It was laughter without joy, sharp enough to slice through bone. The men covered their ears, but the sound lived inside them, vibrating through marrow and skull alike. Some vomited from the pressure. Others wept openly, no longer ashamed. They were trapped in a cage of sound that twisted every human instinct into terror. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the laughter stopped. Silence returned, but it was worse than the noise. The men's ears rang, desperate for sound, until the whispers seeped back in, quieter, softer, more insidious. They no longer came from below, they came from within. Each soldier heard them behind his eyes, muttering truths only he would understand. Secrets never spoken aloud spilled into his mind, dredged from the darkest corners of memory. A man shouted suddenly, leveling his rifle at his comrade. He swore the whispers told him the man beside him had betrayed them all. The others rushed to stop him, but his weapon fired, the muzzle flash lighting terror-stricken faces. The victim fell, lifeless, his blood soaking into the soil. The whispers surged louder for a heartbeat, triumphant, then faded into a low hum, once more. The men realized the trench was feeding on them. Rats scurried across the floor, shrieking in terror. The men followed their frantic path, but the rodents didn't flee upward or outward. They hurled themselves into cracks in the mud, disappearing into the earth as if answering a call. Their squeals vanished quickly, swallowed into silence, leaving only the faint pulse of whispers in their wake. Even vermin knew better than to resist. One soldier dropped his rifle and began to speak with the whispers. His words matched their cadence, his voice blending seamlessly with the chorus. His comrades dragged him back, shaking him violently, but his eyes had rolled white, his mouth moving without pause. He was no longer answering the voices, he was one of them. His throat swelled with unnatural force, producing sounds that no human organ could sustain. Lantern light flared as oil spilled, casting the trench into a flickering storm of shadows. For brief seconds, they saw shapes in the ground, faces pressed against the mud from below, mouths open, whispering in perfect unison. Some faces belonged to the vanished comrades, their features warped but unmistakable. Others were strangers, ancient and hollow-eyed, their lips cracked but still moving. The ground was a grave that never stopped speaking. The commander ordered fire into the soil, and rifles cracked in unison. Bullets tore into the mud, splattering it in all directions. For a moment, the whispers faltered, breaking into static-like noise. Relief swept through the men, fragile and fleeting. Then the ground answered back. The bullets clattered upward, spat out of the mud, bent and twisted. The whispers returned louder than ever, angrier, more vengeful. A foul stench rose, sharp as burning hair and rotting flesh. The mud bubbled, hissing with each word. Steam carried the whispers higher, surrounding the trench until the men felt submerged in sound. They coughed, gagging on the air, their lungs burning with every breath. The voices pressed into them like hands on throats, not killing outright, but savoring the slow suffocation of fear. The ground cracked wider, exposing veins of black slime that pulsed with light. Within that glow swirled shadows, moving like creatures trapped in glass. The whispers bled from those fissures, shrill and desperate, begging to be freed. The men staggered back, horrified, yet entranced, for every word carried a promise: release, survival, salvation, and each man heard it differently, tailored to his deepest need. Desperation fractured their unity. Some shouted to dig, to open the earth and let the voices out. Others screamed to run, though there was nowhere left to flee. Fists flew as fear drove them to turn on one another. The trench became a madhouse, men wrestling in the mud while the whispers surged louder, feeding on their chaos. The soil trembled with delight, quaking beneath their boots. Through it all, the whispers grew sharper, cutting through the madness with one final truth. One of you must remain. The words were clear now, spoken in every voice at once, echoing across the trench like a judgment. The men froze, wide-eyed, staring at one another with dawning horror. The voices weren't merely haunting them, they were negotiating. The fog pressed lower, and the ground throbbed like a heartbeat. The men knew then that survival would not come through courage, nor through firepower. The whispers had chosen their battlefield well. They did not need to kill them outright. They only needed to make the soldiers choose for themselves who would be the first offering to the soil below. The night weighed on them like a coffin lid. Men clung to the trench walls, eyes darting at every shadow, as though the darkness itself had teeth. Each breath came ragged, thick with dread. Then, without warning, a scream tore the silence, a raw sound ripped from the lungs of a soldier at the center of the line. When the others spun to help, he was already gone, leaving only a dark stain soaking into the mud. The soil drank the blood greedily, pulling it down with a hiss. Steam curled upward, foul and metallic, carrying the stench of rusted iron. The men froze, unable to move, watching as the ground pulsed where the blood had seeped. It bubbled once, twice, before settling as though satisfied. The earth was no longer passive, it was alive, and it was hungry. Whispers rose immediately after, sharper than before, threading through the trench with a sinister cadence. Some men swore the voices were celebrating. Others claimed they heard their names entwined in the chant. Panic rippled like fire across the line. Rifles shook in trembling hands, but no one dared fire, afraid that violence would only invite more blood to be spilled. The silence afterward pressed harder than gunfire. A soldier knelt over the stain, trying to trace its edges with his knife, but the ground swallowed the mark before he could finish. His blade clinked against something hard beneath the soil. Not stone, not wood. He recoiled, pale and sweating, swearing he had struck bone the size of a tree trunk. The others pulled him back quickly, afraid to dig deeper, afraid of what might emerge if the soil was disturbed again. Then came the sound, low and guttural like liquid churning through unseen caverns. The ground beneath their boots trembled, vibrating with every syllable. It was no longer whispers now, but voices rising together, layered in grotesque harmony. Each word cracked against the skull like a hammer. Blood began to trickle from ears and noses, not from wounds, but from the sheer force of the sound. The soil demanded more. One man stumbled, slipping in the muck, his hands pressed into the blood-soaked ground, and his skin blistered instantly, peeling in strips. He screamed, flailing backward as others dragged him to safety. His palms smoked in the cold air, red and raw. The stench of burnt flesh filled the trench, mingling with the iron tang of blood. No one dared touch the soil again, yet they all knew it was only a matter of time before someone else fell. Above them, the fog shifted, darkening until it seemed to press downward like a ceiling. What little starlight remained was swallowed whole. Men tilted their heads upward, praying for some glimpse of the heavens, but the blackness smothered every hope. The only light came from the faint, sickly glow that pulsed from the ground, radiating from where blood had spilled. It was as if the soil itself had become a lantern of the damned. The commander shouted orders to reinforce the trench, his voice trembling under the weight of fear. Men obeyed with frantic hands, stacking sandbags and shoveling mud, but the earth resisted. Walls crumbled faster than they could be built, collapsing inward with each effort. The soil seemed determined to consume, rejecting any attempt at fortification. Every spade of mud thrown was replaced with more, thicker and wetter, crawling like flesh. A silence fell once more, but it was deceptive. The men could hear it beneath, the steady drip of blood seeping deeper, echoing far below like rain on hollow stone. Each drop felt amplified, vibrating through their bones. The soil had not finished. It was waiting, patient, like a predator content to let its prey exhaust themselves before the final strike. And the soldiers knew. Deep down, it would strike soon. A lantern tipped, its flames spreading across the ground in a sputter of fire. For a brief moment, the trench glowed bright enough to reveal what lay just beneath the surface. Faces, hundreds of them, pressed upward from the soil, eyes hollow, mouths open in silent screams. Some were fresh, features intact, uniforms still visible. Others were skeletal, skin stretched thin over bone. All were moving, their jaws opening and closing in grotesque rhythm. The fire died quickly, smothered by the damp air, but the images remained burned into the men's minds. They staggered back, pressing against the trench walls, some retching into the mud. No one spoke. There were no words left. The blood had awoken something ancient, something buried beneath centuries of war. Every soldier understood the same truth. This battlefield was not just haunted, it was alive. The first drops of rain began to fall, but the water was wrong. It carried a reddish tint, streaking down helmets and staining uniforms as though the sky itself bled. The soldiers looked upward in horror, but there was no storm cloud above, only the thick fog pressing lower. The rain pattered against the soil, and the ground drank it eagerly, pulsing brighter with each drop. The trench reeked of iron and rot. One man, driven mad by fear, charged forward with his bayonet, stabbing wildly into the earth. His blade sank deep, but when he pulled it free, it dripped not with mud, but with blood, thick and fresh. He screamed, stumbling backward, dropping the weapon as though it burned him. The ground hissed, bubbling louder, voices rising in triumphant chorus. His attack had not weakened it. He had fed it. The men huddled together, trembling, but their unity was fragile. Accusations began to fly, each man swearing another had brought this curse upon them. Some claimed deserters had angered the spirits. Others muttered about old sins buried in the soil, but no explanation mattered. The truth was evident in every glowing pulse beneath their boots. The ground cared for nothing but blood, and it would take it, one way or another. Then, without warning, the trench shifted. The soil lurched upward in a violent surge, knocking men from their feet. They scrambled desperately, clutching rifles, shouting over the roar of moving earth. The ground had split open along its center, revealing a chasm slick with black mud. From within, steam poured upward, carrying the unmistakable stench of blood and decay. Something was stirring below, rising closer with every heartbeat. The commander screamed for retreat, but the exits were gone. The fog sealed both ends of the trench, thicker than stone, impenetrable. Men fired wildly into it, bullets vanishing as though swallowed whole. The sound of their shots was pitiful against the thunder of shifting earth. Panic spread like wildfire, discipline lost. Every man fought for his own survival now, clawing at the walls, desperate to escape the soil's hunger. Another scream cut through the chaos. A soldier had been dragged waist-deep into the mud, his arms flailing wildly as others clutched him. His fingernails ripped away as he clawed at the boards, shrieking for help. But the soil pulled harder, relentless, until his body was swallowed whole. The ground sealed instantly, leaving only a smear of blood bubbling on the surface. The men recoiled in horror, unable to breathe. The whispers surged into words now, clear and commanding. More. The soil demanded more blood, its hunger echoing through every crack and fissure. Some men wept, others fired blindly into the ground. But the voices only grew louder, their rhythm pounding in skulls like war drums. The earth had become an altar, and they were the sacrifices. A soldier collapsed to his knees, sobbing, and drove his knife into his own chest. Blood gushed freely, soaking into the soil, which hissed with delight. The whispers roared in approval, shaking the trench walls until they splintered. Others screamed at him, begging him to stop, but it was too late. His offering had been accepted, and the ground pulsed brighter than before. The trench groaned like a living beast, preparing for more. The men understood the truth. The war around them meant nothing. The enemy they had been sent to fight was irrelevant. The real battle had always been beneath their boots, waiting for its time to rise. Blood had been spilled on this soil for generations, and now it demanded its due. The soldiers were not warriors anymore. They were cattle in a slaughterhouse carved from mud and silence. And as the ground trembled, The whispers rose one final time, weaving into a single voice that filled every ear. This is only the beginning. The trench groaned, as if the earth itself were tearing open. Men staggered, clutching the walls as the mud convulsed beneath their boots. Boards snapped, sandbags collapsed, and the ground split wide, exhaling a wave of air so foul it burned their lungs. From that chasm came a glow, sickly, pulsating, alive. It painted the soldiers' faces in pale light, revealing terror more raw than any battlefield wound. Shapes stirred in the pit, writhing against one another like serpents tangled in endless knots. The glow revealed fragments of limbs not quite human, bending in ways no bone should allow. Fingers longer than bayonets scraped the mud walls, leaving gouges that smoked and hissed. A stench of rot and sulfur rolled out, thick enough to gag even the hardest veterans. The men knew then they were staring at something that had never belonged to their world. The soil shuddered again, and from the pit rose a hand, or what resembled one. Its skin glistened, slick like oil, stretched too thin over muscle that pulsed visibly beneath. Veins glowed faintly beneath its surface, carrying light as though blood itself burned. The hand clawed at the air, curling massive fingers into fists that could crush bone with ease. Soldiers stumbled backward, their rifles shaking uselessly in their grasp. Then came the head, slow and deliberate, emerging like a mountain, forcing its way skyward. Its shape was vaguely human, but distorted, stretched into grotesque proportions. Eyes burned like molten metal, unblinking, searing every man who met their gaze. Its mouth opened, but no sound came, only a rush of hot air, thick with decay, that knocked helmets from heads. When it finally exhaled, the trench walls quivered as though in reverence. Men fired instinctively, rounds cracking into the night, but the bullets vanished into the creature's flesh. The impacts left no wound, no mark, only ripples that shimmered across its body like waves on water. The soldiers' shouts were drowned by the roar of its rising form, a guttural sound that rattled the marrow in their bones. For the first time in their lives, they realized their weapons meant nothing. The creature unfolded further, towering above the trench until it blotted out what little sky remained. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, joints cracking like splintering wood, yet it moved with deliberate grace. Its body seemed carved from the very mud, dripping earth from its frame, as if it had been born from the soil itself. With each movement, the whispers that had tormented them now roared in triumph, echoing through the air. One soldier collapsed to his knees, muttering prayers, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the creature's heartbeat. It was thunderous, rhythmic, pounding through the trench like drums of war. Each beat shook the ground, rattling rifles from trembling hands. The men clutched their ears, but the sound lived within them, vibrating against their chests until it felt like their own hearts had been enslaved. The creature leaned forward, its eyes burning brighter, and the fog recoiled as if afraid. Its gaze swept across the line of soldiers, pausing on each man in turn. Wherever its eyes lingered, the soldier dropped, convulsing violently, blood spurting from nose and ears. They died without a cry, their bodies twitching like marionettes with cut strings. No one dared meet its gaze again, yet none could look away. Its mouth opened wider, stretching beyond anything natural, until its jaw split into a grotesque maw. Rows of teeth gleamed wet and jagged, some broken, some longer than blades, all dripping with black saliva that hissed as it struck the mud. The smell of death surged stronger, coating tongues, stinging eyes. When the creature roared, the sound was not just noise. It was language ancient and hateful, demanding submission. The trench shook violently, boards collapsing, walls sliding inward. Men scrambled for footing, but the mud itself betrayed them, clutching at boots, dragging them down. The creature reached out with one massive arm, snatching a soldier as easily as a child plucks a doll. The man's scream was cut short as the monster's jaws closed, splitting him in half with a crunch that echoed into the night. The soil pulsed brighter with every drop spilled. A soldier hurled a grenade into the pit in desperate defiance. The explosion rocked the trench, smoke billowing thick for a fleeting heartbeat. Hope sparked until the smoke cleared. The creature remained untouched, its burning eyes locked on the thrower. It opened its mouth again, releasing a scream so sharp the man's skull split open, his body dropping lifeless into the mud. The monster had no need for claws when sound itself was a weapon. Its body continued to rise, taller and taller until its full form towered beyond sight. Limbs sprouted where none should exist, extra arms stretching from its torso, twisted appendages dragging through the mud like anchors. Its back split open, releasing tendrils that writhed like snakes, snapping at the air. The men staggered back, hopelessly small against its enormity. They were insects at the feet of a god. Some soldiers broke, dropping weapons and fleeing into the fog. Their screams faded almost instantly, swallowed by the darkness. Others clung to their rifles, firing in vain until their magazines clicked empty. The commander shouted for discipline, but his voice cracked, his orders meaningless. The creature's presence alone shattered every chain of command. Survival was no longer about courage or loyalty. It was about avoiding the gaze of the abyss. The fog began to swirl around the monster, moving as if alive. It coiled around its body like a cloak, obscuring details yet highlighting its vast outline. The eyes burned through the haze, twin suns of corruption staring down at the doomed men. The whispers, once scattered and dissonant, had become a single voice now, echoing with clarity. "We are risen." The words froze the blood of every man still breathing. The creature lowered its face toward the trench, close enough that its hot breath seared exposed skin. Its tongue, long and forked, flicked out, tasting the air, savoring the fear it had conjured. The men gagged as its saliva spattered the ground, burning holes through mud and wood alike. The earth hissed, releasing steam, as though eager to absorb the filth. The monster smiled, lips splitting wider, amused by their horror. Then, with terrifying speed, it struck again. An arm shot into the trench, scooping 3 men at once, crushing them into pulp before they could even scream. Their bodies exploded against its grip, raining gore across helmets and boards. The soldiers staggered back, drenched in the blood of their comrades, their senses numb from the shock. The monster dropped the mangled remains into the soil, which swallowed them whole without a trace. A desperate cry went up to retreat, but the trench was already sealed. The walls had risen higher, closing inward like jaws. The men were penned in, trapped in a pit designed not for survival, but for slaughter. The monster loomed above them, its every movement accompanied by the chorus of whispers they understood now. It had always been beneath them, waiting for the right moment to emerge. One soldier, face streaked with blood and tears, lifted his bayonet and charged, screaming in defiance. His blade sank into the creature's leg, disappearing into flesh that rippled like water. For a heartbeat, he dared to hope. Then the monster's limb crushed him flat, leaving nothing but a smear across the mud. The men recoiled, horrified, knowing bravery was as useless as bullets. The ground itself seemed to pulse in time with the monster's movements, alive and complicit. Blood pooled at its feet, spreading across the trench floor in rivers. The soil drank greedily, glowing brighter with each offering. The whispers grew deafening, no longer taunting, but worshiping, chanting praise to their risen master. The soldiers realized they were not simply fighting a creature, they were standing inside its altar. And as the monster reared to its full height, tendrils writhing, maw gaping wide, the men knew the truth. This was not a beast, not a cryptid, not a demon. It was something older, something born from centuries of blood spilled on this soil. War had only fed it, fattened it, prepared it for this moment. And now, revealed in its full horror, it demanded only one thing: more blood. The trench had become a coffin, its walls groaning as they closed tighter with each tremor. Men scrambled like trapped animals, clawing at mud that slipped through their fingers. Every exit was gone, sealed by walls of fog and collapsing earth. Their hearts pounded louder than artillery, not from courage but from panic. No strategy remained, no formation could save them. Only terror guided their movements now. The monster loomed above, its limbs stretching wider, blotting out what little sky remained. Tendrils writhed like serpents, slamming against the trench floor, splintering boards and snapping spines. Each strike claimed another soldier, their bodies broken before they even hit the ground. The survivors pressed back against the walls, whimpering like children, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of the force bearing down upon them. Desperate shots rang out, muzzle flashes painting brief glimpses of horror. Bullets sank into the creature's flesh and vanished as if swallowed whole. Some soldiers hurled grenades, but the explosions did nothing except scatter mud across their already filthy uniforms. The monster roared, shaking the trench until men collapsed under the vibrations. Their weapons were useless. Every act of defiance only deepened their despair. The fog grew thicker, swallowing lanterns one by one until the trench was lit only by the monster's burning eyes. Men stumbled blindly, colliding with one another, shouting names into the void. The fog answered back, throwing their voices in strange directions, mocking them with echoes. They no longer knew where their comrades were. The trench was no longer a place of war. It was a labyrinth of madness. One soldier tried to climb the wall, digging fingers into the mud, but the ground gave way beneath him. He fell back, screaming as the soil swallowed his legs, dragging him under. His hands flailed desperately, but the mud tightened like a vice, sucking him down until only his helmet remained. The others backed away, terrified to touch the ground, knowing it craved more victims. Another man fled down the trench, shouting that he saw a gap in the fog. The others followed, but when they reached him, he was gone. Only his footprints remained, leading directly into the wall of mist, then stopping as though he had stepped off the edge of the world. The men stood frozen, staring at the final print, realizing escape was nothing but an illusion. The monster bent low, peering into the trench with eyes that seared through flesh. Its gaze swept across the soldiers, paralyzing them where they stood. They could not run, could not breathe, could only wait for its decision. One man collapsed under the pressure, clutching his chest as his heart gave out. The beast hadn't touched him, but its stare alone had ended his life. The soil beneath them began to quake violently, splitting open in jagged cracks. Blood seeped from the fissures, warm and steaming, filling the trench in sluggish streams. The soldiers staggered back, their boots slipping in the crimson flow. The ground was no longer earth, it was flesh, bleeding freely, feeding the creature towering above. With every drop, the whispers grew louder, singing their hymn of triumph. The men screamed for help, though they knew no help could come. Their voices rose into the night, carried away by fog, unheard by any ally. The battlefield beyond was silent, absent of gunfire or marching feet. It was as if the world had abandoned them, leaving this trench cut off from time, reserved only for sacrifice. Hope was no longer a thought, it was a memory. Some soldiers turned on one another, driven mad by terror. Knives flashed, hands grappled, curses echoed. They fought not the creature, but themselves, desperate to push someone else into its grasp. Blood spilled freely, soaking into the soil, and the whispers rose in glee. The monster did not need to kill them. It only needed to watch them destroy each other. The commander tried once more to rally the men, his voice hoarse and broken. He barked orders, demanding they regroup, demanding they hold the line. But his words were drowned by the roar of the beast, a sound so massive it crushed his voice like glass underfoot. His men no longer saw him as a leader. They saw only another doomed soul waiting his turn. Above them, the sky convulsed, clouds swirling into unnatural spirals. Lightning flickered without thunder, illuminating the monster's form in flashes. Its shadow stretched across the trench, vast and endless, as though it consumed the heavens themselves. The men realized with growing dread that they were not merely trapped in a trench, they were trapped in the creature's domain. The world itself was bending to its will. The air grew thin, suffocating, as though the atmosphere was being devoured. Each breath scraped the lungs raw, leaving soldiers gasping like fish on dry land. Some collapsed, clutching their throats, eyes bulging as oxygen slipped away. The monster exhaled and the air grew hotter, thicker, fouler, filled with the stink of rot. It was not just killing them, it was savoring their suffering. One soldier screamed that he saw the faces of the dead in the fog. They floated around him, pale and grinning, mouths whispering promises of release. He reached for them, arms outstretched, and walked willingly into the mist. His body vanished, His scream cut short. The others watched in horror, knowing the fog was not an escape but a trap, yet powerless to stop him. Blood continued to rise, soaking the trench floor until it reached their ankles. It was warm, sticky, clinging to boots like tar. The men recoiled, lifting their legs higher, but the liquid followed, thickening with every heartbeat. The soil drank hungrily, pulsing brighter, feeding the towering beast. The whispers reached a crescendo, chanting in languages long dead, their meaning clear even without translation. There is no escape. The monster reared higher, its limbs stretching wider, its tendrils whipping the air like lashes. Each strike shattered boards, sent mud flying, crushed men into paste. The survivors cowered in corners, shivering, too broken to fight, too afraid to flee. The trench had become a slaughterhouse, every scream another note in the monster's symphony of horror. Some men begged for death, shouting for comrades to shoot them before the creature could take them. Others pressed knives to their throats, shaking too violently to finish the act. Their terror was a feast, each heartbeat another offering. The monster did not rush. It lingered, patient, savoring the despair like wine. Escape was not denied in haste. It was denied with cruelty. The commander raised his pistol, pressing it beneath his chin. His men watched in silence, hollow-eyed, as he pulled the trigger. The crack of the shot echoed, brief, final. His body slumped into the blood-soaked mud, swallowed instantly by the soil. The whispers surged again, louder, rejoicing at his offering. Even in death, he had served their hunger. The survivors knew there would be no dawn, no rescue, no reprieve. The trench was a tomb, and they were the final chapter written in blood and madness. They clutched their rifles without aim, stared into the fog without hope, and waited. The monster loomed above, eternal and merciless, its whispers now a chorus of triumph, and in their final breaths, they understood the truth. There was no escape, only terror everlasting. Dawn never came. Where morning light should have broken across the horizon, there was only mist, thick, gray, and endless. The battlefield was silent now, stripped of the screams and roars that had filled it through the night. The trench lay abandoned, its walls collapsed, its floor drowned in a stagnant pool of red and black mud. No sign of life remained, only the echo of horror etched into the ground itself. Crows circled high overhead, but none dared descend. The stench was too heavy, not the ordinary reek of corpses, but something fouler, older. Animals in the forest beyond kept their distance, refusing to cross the invisible line where the soil began to hum faintly, like a low vibration only the brave could notice. Nature itself recoiled from the place, as if it knew what still lingered beneath. Patrols sent days later found nothing of the men who had once held the line. Helmets lay scattered like discarded shells, rifles rusting half-buried in mud. Letters from home floated in the waterlogged trench, ink smeared until the words were unreadable. Yet there were no bodies, not a single bone, not a trace of flesh. The men had vanished entirely, as though erased from history. The officers who received the report dismissed it as exaggeration. They claimed shellfire must have buried the unit, or that scavengers had dragged the remains away. But those who had walked the trench knew better. They spoke of whispers still curling through the soil, faint but constant, taunting anyone who listened too long. They left quickly, unwilling to linger, and swore never to return. Over time, the battlefield was abandoned. New lines were drawn elsewhere, and this stretch of ground was left untouched. Avoided even by the desperate, no one rebuilt the trenches, no one salvaged the weapons. Maps quietly omitted the site, erasing it from official record. But among the soldiers, rumors spread like wildfire, rumors of a cursed place where the earth itself consumed men whole. Decades passed and grass grew over the shattered ground. Trees crept back along the edges, their roots probing into the soil cautiously. Birds sang again, though never at night. To an untrained eye, it looked like any other field, scarred, yes, but peaceful in its silence. Yet the air remained heavy, thicker than elsewhere, as though time itself slowed within the forgotten boundary. Farmers who tried to reclaim the land abandoned it within weeks. Their plows broke against unseen obstacles. Striking bone-like ridges deep beneath the dirt, crops refused to sprout. withering within days as though the soil rejected life. Livestock kept there grew sick, bleeding in terror at night until their hearts gave out. Eventually, the land was left fallow, shunned by all who valued their sanity. Children in nearby villages whispered stories about the place. They said on still nights the ground glowed faintly red, as though fire smoldered beneath. Some claimed to hear voices when the wind blew across the field, low murmurs that sounded like prayers twisted into curses. Parents forbade them from venturing close, though every generation produced a few who ignored the warnings. None who crossed the line after dark ever returned. Historians found fragments of records hinting at the vanished unit. The documents were vague, filled with contradictions. Some said the men deserted. Others insisted they were slaughtered by enemy forces, but the most chilling accounts came from scattered survivors, men who swore they had transferred out just before the event. They spoke of whispers, of eyes in the dark, of comrades dissolving into nothing. Their testimonies were ignored, buried with the rest. When the war ended, memorials were built across the land, honoring battles both glorious and tragic, but no monument rose on that soil. It was too quiet, too forgotten, too dangerous to remember. Families asked about their sons, their brothers, their fathers, but the answers were always the same. Missing in action, no closure was offered, no graves to weep upon. Their names simply faded into absence. Travelers who strayed too close told of strange sensations, boots sinking deeper than they should, air colder near the ground, the faint impression of being watched from below. Some swore they saw faces in the mud, pressing upward for a moment before vanishing again. Most laughed off the stories, dismissing them as superstition, but those who had seen the battlefield firsthand never laughed. The soil remained restless, shifting under storms, humming during full moons. Scientists sent to test samples found anomalies, magnetic interference, unexplained radiation, traces of blood and layers of dirt where none should exist. Their reports were locked away, marked as classified. Nothing more was said publicly, but the land was quietly fenced off, declared unsafe, and forgotten once again. Decades turned into a century, and the war itself became history. Veterans died, survivors silenced, and the trench faded from memory. Yet at night, in the villages nearby, elders still spoke of the cursed ground. They warned that the earth had not forgiven, that it was waiting for more blood to be spilled. Children shivered at the tales but could not resist the thrill of fear they carried. Adventurers came eventually, drawn by the legends. Ghost hunters, historians, fools seeking glory. Some returned with strange recordings, low hums that crackled through their devices, voices that should not exist. Others never returned at all. Their abandoned gear was found days later, rusted and broken, half buried in the soil as though the earth itself had pulled it down. The battlefield became known by a name whispered in taverns and carried on hushed lips, the field of silence. No guidebooks marked it, no signs pointed the way. Yet those who sought it could always find it, as though the land itself called them closer. And always they left with the same impression that they were trespassing on ground that still breathed with hunger. Legends grew, blending truth with superstition. Some claimed the creature still walked beneath, stirring when it smelled blood. Others insisted it had never left, that it was the soil itself, a living wound carved into the world. Few agreed on details, but all shared the same warning. Once you stepped onto that battlefield, you belonged to it. Even now, when the wind is still and the moon is high, the land remembers, shadows bend strangely. Voices drift through the night, and the ground feels soft beneath your feet, as though something waits just below the surface. Travelers quicken their pace, never daring to linger, never daring to listen too closely. The soil does not forgive curiosity. The names of the lost soldiers were erased from rosters, forgotten by governments, their stories untold. But the earth did not forget. Their screams, their blood, their fear, all of it soaked into the mud, preserved forever. Each step across that soil is a step across their memory, a trespass into a place that does not want to be disturbed. And so the battlefield remains untouched, avoided, and silent. Not silent in peace, but in warning. For beneath the grass and mud lies a hunger too ancient to die, a hunger that waits patiently for the next war to feed it. And when men return with rifles and cannons, when blood once more spills freely into the ground, the forgotten battlefield will awaken, and it will remember. When dawn finally broke, the trenches were empty, silent as a graveyard. No bodies, no survivors, only the claw marks carved deep into the earth, proof that something inhuman had passed through. History buried the reports, dismissing them as madness born of war, but the truth lingers in whispers on that battlefield. Men didn't just face the enemy, they faced a terror that erased them from memory. And if the soil remembers, then perhaps it still waits.